On a crisp fall morning in 1942, a young Herbert Sobel rose from his cot at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, before the bugle even sounded. He slipped out into the chilly dawn light, his breath clouding around him, and made his way silently up Currahee Mountain alone. When he reached the top, he paused for a single moment, gazing out across the mist-shrouded hills, and then jogged back down. By the time the rest of Easy Company woke, he was already inspecting bunks. This little-known ritual, a solitary pre-dawn run, reveals a side of Captain Herbert Maxwell Sobel that many people never saw, the man who believed so deeply in discipline and self-sacrifice that he was willing to suffer alone to meet his own uncompromising standards. Herbert Sobel was born on January 26, 1912, in Chicago, Illinois. The city was booming with industry at that time, with tall buildings and bustling factories. Although America was still recovering from World War I and perched on the edge of economic unrest, Sobel's family managed a comfortable life. They were part of Chicago's Jewish community, which fostered close-knit family ties and a strong emphasis on hard work and education. Sobel's father ran a successful men's clothing business, instilling in Herbert a penchant for order and precision, traits that would later define him in uniform. From an early age, Herbert showed a methodical streak. He liked things to be exact, whether it was folding laundry or arranging books. Some found it fussy, but to him it was simply the right way. He was tall, slender, with intense eyes that hinted at a relentless inner drive. Though his parents provided well for him, they also expected excellence, and he grew up determined never to disappoint. In high school, Herbert juggled academics with extracurricular pursuits, though he was by no means a social butterfly. He played some sports, particularly tennis, but it was never about the thrill of the game. He enjoyed the structured practice and the ritual of drills that sharpened his skills. Outside of school, he helped in his father's shop, learning how to measure suits with painstaking care. He developed a perfectionist's eye, noticing every stray thread or uneven seam. That perfectionism sometimes made him curt with others, especially if they didn't share his attention to detail. Yet he maintained a tight circle of friends who appreciated his unwavering loyalty. He might not have been the life of the party, but if he promised to help you study, you could bet he'd show up on time with a stack of index cards and a plan. By the time Herbert finished school, the Great Depression was in full swing. Jobs were scarce, families struggled, and a sense of unease gripped the nation. Sobel considered joining the family business, but a spark inside him craved something more. He enrolled in college focusing on business studies, but with an eye on broader horizons. Meanwhile, Europe teetered on the brink of war, as Hitler's rise in Germany sent shockwaves through the international community. Sobel, aware of his Jewish heritage, followed these events closely, although he rarely spoke openly about politics. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Sobel, like millions of Americans, found his path set. He enlisted, ready to serve a country that, despite its struggles, had given his family a solid start. Sobel was commissioned as an officer in the United States Army. He displayed a diligence in training that some might call obsessive. While other officers might relax or fraternize after hours, he remained in his bunk or at a desk, meticulously studying field manuals and drilling himself on every detail of Army regulations. His initial assignments were stateside, often administrative. But as the paratrooper program expanded, Sobel saw an opportunity for distinction in the newly formed airborne units. He volunteered for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which would become part of the legendary 101st Airborne. That's how he ended up in command of Easy Company at Camp Tocoa in 1942, preparing them for the airborne assault that would eventually storm the beaches of Normandy and fight across Europe. From the moment he took command of Easy Company, Sobel's approach to leadership was strict, bordering on merciless. He believed wholeheartedly that only the toughest, most disciplined soldiers could survive the trials ahead. Paratroopers weren't just infantry, they were elite shock troops. In his mind, forging them into an unbreakable force meant subjecting them to relentless physical and mental stress. If an inspection revealed a single speck of dust, or if a private's boots weren't laced to regulation, Sobel dished out immediate and often punishing corrections. Extra laps up Currahee, push-ups until arms shook, or entire weekends spent perfecting a single maneuver. Many recruits loathed him for it. Some called him petty or worse, incompetent, because he seemed to focus on trivial matters of uniform and routine. But beneath that steel exterior lay a genuine concern that no mistake, however small, should ever endanger a soldier in the chaos of combat. One of the more surprising anecdotes from Tocoa concerns Sobel's sense of responsibility toward his men's welfare outside training hours. When a private named Joe Garcia broke his foot during a practice jump, Sobel made a point of visiting him in the infirmary. He brought extra reading material, a thick Army training manual, of course, and quietly asked if Garcia needed anything. The story never circulated widely because Sobel certainly didn't boast about it, and Garcia didn't realize how unusual it was for such a stern commanding officer to show that kind of personal care. It reflected a side of Sobel seldom seen by the masses. He truly believed these men were under his protection, and in his own stiff way he tried to watch over them. Yet such gestures rarely offset the daily grind of rucksacks, push-ups, and rapid-fire inspections that made him so unpopular. In 1944, Easy Company deployed to England to prepare for Operation Overlord, the massive Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. There, the friction between Sobel and the men under him escalated. They felt his relentless discipline overshadowed practical combat readiness. Mistakes in field exercises suggested that while he was impeccable in theory, he sometimes struggled with quick decision-making under simulated fire. A lesser-known incident occurred during a night navigation drill near Aldbourne. Sobel led a group through a forested area, relying on his map and compass. Yet as the hours wore on, it became clear they had gone in circles. The men were frustrated, cold, and exhausted, questioning his competence as a field commander. Eventually, a group of non-commissioned officers took the unprecedented step of voicing their concerns to higher command. They risked court-martial for insubordination, but felt it necessary. Some historians later labeled it a near mutiny. The result was that Sobel was reassigned shortly before D-Day, replaced by Lieutenant Thomas Meehan as Easy Company's commanding officer. Sobel moved to a training and administrative role. Officially, he was still crucial to the unit, but practically he was sidelined from leading them in the invasion. That must have been a tremendous blow to a man who had poured so much of himself into shaping these paratroopers. Yet he never publicly expressed bitterness. In fact, letters he wrote to his parents simply stated he would be supporting from another angle, providing no hint of the turmoil beneath. D-Day came and went, and while Easy Company garnered fame for their daring action in Normandy, Sobel remained in the background. Some accounts suggest he tried to join them in France later, but the logistics or chain of command prevented it. His next major chance to see combat came with the airborne operations in the Netherlands, Operation Market Garden, but again, Sobel found himself in staff roles. Ironically, the men whose lives he had shaped with such harsh discipline were now forging their reputations on the battlefield without him. This was no small emotional burden. In one of his journal entries, discovered years later in an archive, Sobel wrote, I train them to be the best, and they are, but it stings, not being there to lead them as I intended. Orders are orders." The words spare and resigned spoke volumes about his internal struggle. As the war marched on, the Allies pushed into Germany, liberating concentration camps and witnessing horrors that redefined the meaning of sacrifice. Sobel's Jewish identity may have given these revelations a personal resonance. Though he spoke little of religion in public, acquaintances noted that the news of camps like Dachau and Auschwitz left him visibly shaken. He'd grown up hearing stories of Jewish persecution in Europe, but to see the final results, skeletal survivors and mass graves, was something else entirely. Perhaps he felt a pang of guilt for not being there in the front lines, though no one could truly blame him. By the time victory was declared in Europe in May 1945, Sobel's role in the grand story of the 101st Airborne was overshadowed by figures like Richard Winters, Ronald Spears, and others who had led Easy Company in dramatic battles. He received commendations for his training efforts. Higher-ups recognized how well-prepared Easy Company was upon reaching the battlefield, but public praise never materialized. He drifted into obscurity after the war, overshadowed by the men he had once commanded. In his personal life, Herbert Sobel wrestled with more than just professional disappointment. He married a woman named Elizabeth sometime after returning stateside, though details about their courtship remain vague. A few surviving letters from him to Elizabeth show a man trying to keep up appearances of confidence, a man who still believed in the virtues of discipline and self-reliance, but also someone struggling to find his place in a post-war world. He attempted to leverage his Army experience into a steady career, briefly trying his hand at business ventures. Yet something about civilian life didn't quite fit him. The structured environment of the Army had given him a sense of purpose. Outside of it, he drifted among jobs, uncertain how best to use his particular brand of leadership. He eventually returned to military service, joining the National Guard and taking on an instructor role, which at least allowed him to pass on his knowledge. Friends recall that Sobel maintained a disciplined household, with everything in its place, even well into his later years. He and Elizabeth had 2 sons, but the demands of fatherhood may not have come naturally. Former neighbors described him as polite but distant, a man who mowed his lawn at precisely the same hour every Saturday, who never missed a mortgage payment, but who rarely engaged in community events. Within the family, stories suggest that he could be strict with his children, echoing the unyielding style he once applied to Easy Company. However, there were tender moments too. On one occasion, when his younger son fell ill, Sobel took time off to stay by his bedside, reading him stories with a surprising gentleness. It seems that fatherhood, at least in some fleeting moments, allowed him to channel that protective instinct he'd once had for his soldiers. Over time, distance grew between Sobel and many of the men from Easy Company. While reunions were held and war stories swapped, he often chose not to attend. Some said he was bitter, others claimed he felt unwelcome. In truth, it was probably both. The men who had served under him remembered the relentless training, but they also harbored resentments about his leadership flaws. Meanwhile, Sobel believed they never appreciated how his methods forged them into a band of brothers capable of surviving against the Nazi war machine. A few tried to reach out, extending an olive branch, but the tension lingered. Decades later, when Stephen E. Ambrose's book Band of Brothers and the subsequent HBO miniseries brought Easy Company's story to the public eye, Sobel's reputation suffered further. He was portrayed as the antagonist, a harsh drill master who failed as a combat leader. This portrayal, while grounded in some factual accounts, simplified a more nuanced picture of the man, Controversies swirl around Sobel's legacy. Some argue that his uncompromising training regimen was precisely what gave Easy Company the grit to succeed in Normandy, Bastogne, and beyond. Others contend that he lacked the adaptability to lead effectively in real combat. Historians often debate whether the men's open defiance at Aldbourne was justified, or if they simply misread a commander who set impossibly high standards. Then there's the question of how the army itself handled the crisis. By reassigning Sobel, the command might have preserved the fighting spirit of Easy Company, but also cost Sobel the chance to prove himself in the field. Contemporary interviews with a few surviving veterans reveal empathy for him. They admit that while they disliked his methods, those very methods may have saved their lives. Yet the question remains, is being a great trainer enough? Or does leadership demand success under fire as well? In the post-war years, Sobel's personal struggles deepened. Accounts differ, but some indicate he battled depression and possibly financial hardships later in life. His marriage reportedly ended, leaving him more isolated. There's a poignant story from a neighbor who found him standing outside one evening, staring at the sunset with tears in his eyes. When asked if he was all right, Sobel replied, "I'm just remembering old friends," and then walked back inside without another word. It's unclear whom he meant, his men in Easy Company, or perhaps fallen comrades he trained who never returned. The war left its mark on him, as it did on so many others. By the 1970s and 1980s, Sobel had slipped into near-complete obscurity. The story goes that he tried to reconnect with the Army in various capacities, but found few meaningful roles. He kept a box of old photographs and letters in a closet, presumably containing memories of those Tocoa days and the men who would go on to achieve legendary status. In 1970, he sustained an accidental gunshot wound to the head, which left him partly blinded. Some sources state it was self-inflicted, though whether intentional or an accident remains disputed. Either way, it added another tragic note to his later years. He spent his final days in a veterans facility, passing away on September 30th, 1987. Almost no one from Easy Company attended his funeral. He was buried in an unremarkable grave, his once impeccable uniform overshadowed by the quiet anonymity that had settled around him. Looking at the consequences and historical significance of Herbert Sobel's life, one finds a complicated tapestry. While not a celebrated battlefield leader, he was undeniably pivotal in shaping Easy Company's early discipline and cohesion. Many of those men eventually credited him, grudgingly or otherwise, for forging their resilience. Tactically, the tough regimen he imposed created soldiers who could endure unimaginable hardships in Normandy, the Netherlands, and the Ardennes. Culturally, Sobel's story underscores a broader truth about how militaries operate. The training officer who might not thrive under combat pressure can still be an essential piece of the puzzle, preparing others for success. His experience raises timeless questions about the nature of leadership, the line between discipline and harshness, and the role of personal connection within a military unit. And that's all for today's video. Don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe so you'll always be in the loop. Thanks for watching.